The fluorescent lights of the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit flickered as Dr. Elena Vasquez pressed her trembling fingers against the cold metal table in Interview Room 7. Around her, federal agents shuffled through case files they couldn't solve, murders they couldn't explain, and victims whose final words remained forever silenced. What they didn't know was that the woman they'd been mocking for her thick Louisiana accent for the past 6 months possessed an ability that would crack the most impossible case in the Bureau's history. The same linguistic peculiarities they ridiculed during coffee breaks were actually the key to communicating with witnesses who had been dead for decades. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In 3 hours, Elena would reveal that the Riverside Strangler hadn't stopped killing 20 years ago. He had simply gotten better at hiding the bodies. And the only reason she knew this was because his victims had been trying to tell her where to find the evidence all along, speaking in the forgotten dialects of the dead that only she could understand. The mockery started on Elena's first day at the FBI field office in Richmond, Virginia. As she introduced herself to the Behavioral Analysis Unit, her voice carried the unmistakable cadence of rural Louisiana, a melodic drawl that seemed to stretch each syllable like warm honey. The other agents exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their assumptions regarding her intelligence and professional competence. Dr. Marcus Thornfield, the unit's senior profiler, barely looked up from his case files when she entered the morning briefing. His Ivy League credentials hung on the wall like shields against anyone who hadn't followed the traditional path to federal law enforcement. The fact that Elena had earned her doctorate in linguistics from Tulane University while working nights at a funeral home to pay for school meant nothing to him. All he heard was an accent that suggested rural backwardness rather than academic brilliance. Elena had grown up in the bayous outside New Orleans, where her grandmother, Marie Boudreau, had taught her that death was not an ending but a transition. The old Creole woman had claimed their family possessed a gift passed down through generations, the ability to hear voices that others couldn't detect. Elena had dismissed these stories as folklore until she started graduate school and began experiencing auditory phenomena that conventional science couldn't explain. Her doctoral dissertation on extinct regional dialects had uncovered something extraordinary. While researching speech patterns in historical recordings, Elena discovered she could understand languages that had been dead for centuries. Not just the words, but the emotional context, the cultural nuances, the desperate urgency that seemed to emanate from voices captured on old recordings. Her professors attributed this to exceptional linguistic intuition, but Elena suspected something far more unusual was happening. The FBI had recruited her specifically for her expertise in dialectology and phonetic analysis. Serial killers often left linguistic clues in their communications, and Elena's ability to decode regional speech patterns, historical language variations, and even purposeful mispronunciations had proven invaluable during her graduate work with local police departments. Her research had helped solve 3 cold cases in Louisiana by identifying geographical origins of anonymous letters and recorded threats. But the Richmond field office viewed her as an academic experiment rather than a serious investigator. Agent Sarah Richmond, whose family connections had secured her assignment to high-profile cases despite mediocre performance evaluations, made no effort to hide her disdain for Elena's unconventional background. During team meetings, Richmond would openly roll her eyes whenever Elena offered insights, often interrupting with comments about staying focused on real evidence rather than linguistic theories. The discrimination was subtle but persistent. Elena found herself assigned to case files that other agents considered dead ends, murders from decades past where conventional investigative methods had been exhausted. While her colleagues worked current cases with media attention and career advancement potential, she spent her days in the basement archives, surrounded by boxes of evidence from unsolved homicides that had grown cold during previous administrations. Agent David Foster, the youngest member of the team, occasionally showed Elena basic courtesy, but even he seemed embarrassed by her presence during interactions with federal prosecutors or visiting officials. The unit's reputation for sophisticated behavioral analysis clashed with Elena's humble origins and distinctive speech patterns, creating an image problem that supervisors wanted to minimize. Elena's performance evaluations consistently rated her work as satisfactory, despite breakthrough insights that had advanced several investigations. Her analysis of geographic dialect patterns had helped narrow suspect pools in 3 different cases, but these contributions were attributed to team efforts rather than individual expertise. When she correctly identified the regional origin of an anonymous caller in a kidnapping case, Agent Richmond claimed credit for directing the linguistic analysis that led to the breakthrough. The isolation was particularly painful during the weekly case review meetings where agents presented their progress to Unit Chief Patricia Brooks. Elena would cite quietly while colleagues discussed sophisticated psychological profiles and behavioral patterns, knowing that her own insights were dismissed before she could articulate them. Her attempts to contribute were often cut short by supervisors who claimed time constraints, though they never seemed to apply these same limitations to agents with more prestigious backgrounds. The technical aspects of her work were equally frustrating. Elena had been assigned the oldest computer equipment and given access to linguistic databases that were years out of date. When she requested updated phonetic analysis software that could help her research historical speech patterns, Agent Richmond argued that such tools were unnecessary for basic archival work. The message was clear. Elena's role was to organize old case files, not to conduct serious investigative analysis. Her living situation reflected the same professional marginalization. While other agents lived in suburban apartments near the federal building, Elena rented a small room above a funeral home in Richmond's historic district. The elderly owner, Mr. James Whitmore, had offered her the space at below-market rates after learning about her academic background in mortuary linguistics, a field that studied communication patterns in death-related contexts. The funeral home environment provided Elena with unexpected peace. Unlike the sterile federal building where her colleagues barely acknowledged her presence, the quiet dignity of Mr. Whitmore's establishment offered a sense of purpose and respect. He appreciated her knowledge of historical funeral customs and often asked for her insights into old burial records written in various regional dialects. It was during her evening hours at the funeral home that Elena began to notice the auditory phenomena that would change everything. While organizing historical records in the basement archive, she started hearing whispered conversations that seemed to emanate from areas where no living person was present. The voices spoke in dialects she recognized from her academic research, patterns of speech that had disappeared from living use decades or even centuries ago. Initially, Elena attributed these experiences to exhaustion and stress from her demanding work schedule. The combination of hostile colleagues and challenging case material was taking a psychological toll that manifested in auditory hallucinations. But the voices were remarkably consistent, speaking in historically accurate dialects with emotional content that suggested genuine communication rather than random mental noise. One evening, while reviewing a 30-year-old murder case, Elena heard a woman's voice speaking in a dialect characteristic of 1940s Appalachian communities. The voice provided specific details about the murder that weren't included in the official case files, details that Elena later confirmed through independent research in historical newspaper archives. The accuracy of this information forced her to consider possibilities that challenged everything she thought she understood about human communication. The case involved Margaret Flynn, a young teacher who had disappeared from a rural Virginia town in 1952. Official records indicated that her body was never found and the investigation had been closed due to lack of evidence. But the voice Elena heard provided a detailed account of the murder, including the location where Margaret's remains had been hidden and the identity of her killer, who had died of natural causes in 1978. Elena spent weeks researching the information provided by the mysterious voice, using her academic credentials to access historical records and archived police files. Every detail proved accurate, from the specific geological features of the burial site to the personal history of the suspected killer. The evidence was overwhelming, but she had no way to explain how she had obtained information that had eluded professional investigators for 50 years. The discovery forced Elena to confront the possibility that her grandmother's stories about family gifts might have contained elements of truth. Perhaps her exceptional abilities in linguistic analysis weren't just academic talent, but manifestations of something far more extraordinary. The voices she was hearing seemed to come from murder victims whose cases had remained unsolved, speaking in the dialects they had used while alive and providing information that could finally bring them justice. But revealing these experiences to her FBI colleagues would be professional suicide. Federal law enforcement operated on empirical evidence and logical deduction, not supernatural phenomenon. Elena's credibility was already questionable due to her unconventional background. Claiming to communicate with the dead would end her career immediately and permanently. Instead, she began developing methods to translate her unusual experiences into conventional investigative techniques. By presenting her insights as products of advanced linguistic analysis and historical research, Elena could contribute to case resolution without revealing the true source of her information. It was a delicate balance between professional survival and moral responsibility to the victims whose voices only she could hear. As winter settled over Richmond, Elena continued her quiet work in the basement archives, surrounded by unsolved cases and whispered voices that spoke in languages the living world had forgotten. She had no idea that her unique abilities were about to be tested in ways that would reshape not only her own career, but the entire approach to unsolved murder investigations within the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The emergency call came through at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in February, shattering the usual quiet of the FBI field office. Elena had been working late in the archives, as had become her routine, when the building's communication systems erupted with urgent alerts. Multiple agencies were converging on a scene in downtown Richmond where construction workers had made a discovery that would challenge everything the Bureau thought it knew about one of America's most notorious unsolved serial murder cases. Agent Patricia Brooks burst through the archive doors with an expression Elena had never seen before. The unit chief's normally composed demeanor had cracked, revealing the kind of professional panic that suggested career-defining consequences. Behind her, Agent Sarah Richmond clutched preliminary scene reports with hands that trembled despite her usual arrogant confidence. "Vasquez, we need you at the Riverside construction site immediately," Brooks announced, her voice cutting through the basement's dusty silence. "They've found something that changes everything about the Riverside Strangler case." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Elena looked up from the 1960s murder files she had been analyzing, her mind still partially attuned to the whispered conversations that had been growing more frequent and insistent over the past weeks. The voices seemed to be building towards something significant, becoming more urgent in their attempts to communicate information that conventional investigation had missed for decades. The Riverside Strangler case was legendary within federal law enforcement circles, a series of brutal murders that had terrorized Virginia communities from 1978 to 1982 before mysteriously stopping. 12 victims, all young women between the ages of 19 and 26, had been found strangled with distinctive ligature marks that suggested both ritual significance and personal psychology. The killer had left no DNA evidence, no fingerprints, and no witnesses. After 4 years of intensive investigation, the case had gone cold, with most experts assuming the perpetrator had either died or moved to a different region. Agent Richmond's voice carried barely controlled hysteria as she briefed Elena during the drive to the scene. Construction crews were excavating for a new hotel foundation when they uncovered what appears to be a burial site. Multiple bodies, all showing signs of strangulation consistent with the Riverside pattern. But here's the problem. Carbon dating suggests these victims were buried between 1995 and 2005, 20 years after the Riverside Strangler supposedly stopped killing. The implications were staggering. If the new bodies were connected to the original Riverside murders, it meant the killer had never stopped. He had simply become more sophisticated about hiding his victims, allowing investigators to believe they were dealing with a historical case rather than an ongoing threat. The Bureau's assumption that the Riverside Strangler was dead or inactive had left communities vulnerable to continued predation for more than 2 decades. Elena felt a familiar chill as they approached the construction site. The voices that had been whispering in the archives were growing stronger, speaking in dialects that spanned multiple time periods and geographical regions. She could distinguish at least 8 different women speaking in accents ranging from 1970s urban Virginia to 1990s rural Appalachian communities. Each voice carried the desperate urgency of someone trying to communicate vital information that could prevent future deaths. The crime scene was chaos orchestrated with federal precision. Floodlights illuminated the excavation site where forensic teams worked with archaeological care to preserve evidence that might finally solve one of America's most persistent serial murder mysteries. Local police had established a perimeter that kept curious onlookers at a distance, while federal agents coordinated with coroners and forensic anthropologists to process what appeared to be the largest serial killer burial ground discovered in Virginia history. Dr. Marcus Thornfield stood near the excavation site, his usual academic arrogance replaced by professional bewilderment that suggested this discovery had shattered his confidence in established investigative protocols. As the unit's senior profiler, he had written extensively about the Riverside case, arguing that the killer's sudden cessation indicated either death or imprisonment on unrelated charges. The existence of additional victims spanning decades made his published analysis look like amateur speculation rather than expert insight. Vasquez, Thornfield called out as Elena approached the perimeter tape, "We need your linguistic expertise to analyze potential communications this killer might have left behind. If he's been active for 40 years instead of 4, there might be written or recorded evidence we missed during the original investigation." Elena nodded, though her attention was focused on the voices that were now speaking with unprecedented clarity and urgency. The murder victims were providing detailed accounts of their final hours, describing a killer whose methods had evolved significantly since the 1970s. The early victims spoke of a young man driven by rage and sexual pathology. The later voices described an older predator who had learned to study his victims for months before attacking, developing sophisticated techniques for avoiding detection. Agent Foster approached with forensic reports that were rewriting the Bureau's understanding of serial killer behavior patterns. "Elena, look at this. The positioning of the bodies suggests ritual significance that wasn't apparent in the original cases. Each victim was buried with personal items that weren't reported missing from the crime scenes. Either the killer took trophies and buried them later, or he kept the bodies for extended periods before disposal." The voices were providing Elena with information that forensic analysis would take weeks to uncover. She could hear descriptions of the killer's voice, his physical appearance across different time periods, and most importantly, the locations where he had kept victims before killing them. Several of the voices spoke of a basement workshop where the killer had constructed elaborate restraint devices and recording equipment to document his crimes. But translating this supernatural intelligence into actionable investigative leads required extraordinary care. Elena had to present her insights as products of linguistic analysis and behavioral profiling rather than communication with the dead. Any suggestion that her information came from paranormal sources would destroy her credibility and end her involvement in the case that was clearly building toward a climactic confrontation. Agent Richmond was coordinating with local law enforcement to review missing persons reports span 4 decades, searching for patterns that might identify additional victims. The scope of the investigation was expanding beyond anything the Richmond field office had handled, requiring resources and expertise from multiple federal agencies. Elena realized she was witnessing the kind of case that defines careers and reshapes investigative procedures throughout the Bureau. As dawn broke over the excavation site, Elena found herself in an impossible position. The voices of the dead were providing her with specific information about the killer's current activities. He was still alive, still hunting, and planning to eliminate witnesses who might connect him to the newly discovered burial ground. But revealing this information would require explanations that would end her career and possibly land her in psychiatric evaluation. The pressure intensified when Agent Brooks approached with updates from the forensic anthropology team. Vasquez, we've confirmed 17 victims in this burial site, spanning from 1995 to 2019. The most recent burial was less than 4 years ago, which means this killer is almost certainly still active. We're looking at one of the longest-running serial murder cases in American history. Elena felt the weight of moral responsibility settling over her like a suffocating blanket. The voices were becoming more insistent, providing warnings about the killer's plans to eliminate evidence and potential witnesses. She could hear descriptions of his current appearance, his vehicle, and the industrial location where he was preparing to destroy materials that could link him to decades of murder. Dr. Thornfield gathered the investigative team near the forensic command post, his expression reflecting the professional crisis that threatened his reputation and career advancement. We're dealing with a killer who has successfully evaded detection for over 40 years while maintaining an active murder pattern. This suggests either extraordinary luck or inside knowledge of investigative procedures. We need to consider the possibility that he has connections to law enforcement or forensic communities. The suggestion that the Riverside Strangler might have professional connections to criminal justice agencies sent a chill through the assembled investigators. Elena heard several of the voices confirming this possibility. The killer had demonstrated knowledge of crime scene procedures, evidence collection techniques, and investigative timelines that suggested either law enforcement training or access to confidential information about ongoing investigations. Agent Richmond was reviewing personnel files when she made a discovery that changed the entire trajectory of the investigation. "Brooks, we have a problem. The original Riverside investigation included consultation with several civilian experts who had access to crime scene details and investigative strategies. One of them was Dr. Herbert Manning, a forensic psychologist who worked with multiple law enforcement agencies during the 1970s and 80s. Elena's blood ran cold as the voices suddenly became agitated, speaking rapidly in overlapping dialects that painted a picture of systematic betrayal spanning decades. Dr. Manning hadn't just consulted on the Riverside case. He had used his position to monitor investigative progress while continuing his murder spree with complete knowledge of how authorities were attempting to track him. The voices provided Elena with details about Manning's current activities that made immediate action essential. He was preparing to flee the country after eliminating evidence and potential witnesses who might expose his decades of deception. But Manning had made one critical error. He didn't know that his victims had been trying to communicate with someone who could finally understand their desperate warnings. Agent Foster was coordinating with database analysts when the first confirmation came through federal records. Dr. Herbert Manning, age 73, currently residing in Mechanicsville, Virginia. He's been a consultant on serial murder cases for over 30 years, including the original Riverside investigation. His psychological profiles were instrumental in shaping the Bureau's understanding of the killer's behavior patterns. Elena realized she was looking at the ultimate law enforcement nightmare, a serial killer who had spent decades helping police investigate his own crimes while using that access to stay ahead of discovery. Manning had shaped investigative assumptions, influenced resource allocation, and even participated in victim identification efforts while secretly continuing to murder women whose disappearances he helped explain through sophisticated psychological theories. The voices were providing Elena with increasingly urgent warnings about Manning's immediate plans. He knew the discovery of the burial site would eventually lead investigators to him, and he was preparing final actions that would eliminate both physical evidence and human witnesses. According to the voices, Manning had identified at least 3 people who might connect him to the murders, including a former assistant who had discovered suspicious materials in his office. Agent Brooks was reviewing Manning's consultation history when the scope of his deception became fully apparent. He's been involved in at least 15 serial murder investigations across 6 states over the past 30 years. If he's the killer, he's had access to investigative details on hundreds of cases, giving him unprecedented knowledge of how to avoid detection. Elena found herself facing an impossible decision. The voices were providing her with specific information about Manning's current location and immediate plans, including details about weapons he had acquired and individuals he was planning to eliminate. She had enough supernatural intelligence to prevent multiple murders and capture one of America's most prolific serial killers. But revealing this information would require explanations that would destroy her credibility and end her involvement in the most important case of her career. The crisis reached its peak when Agent Richmond received a call from local police. Dr. Manning had failed to appear for a scheduled consultation at the Virginia State Police headquarters, and his office staff reported that he had canceled all appointments for the following week. His disappearance suggested that he was aware of the investigation's direction and was implementing escape plans that might have been prepared for decades. Elena looked around the crime scene where federal agents worked desperately to process evidence that might prevent future murders, knowing that she possessed information that could end the case immediately. The voices of 17 murdered women were pleading with her to act on their warnings, to use their desperate communications to finally bring their killer to justice. But taking that action would require Elena to reveal abilities that conventional law enforcement couldn't accept or understand. She would have to risk everything she had worked to achieve, challenging institutional skepticism that had already marginalized her based on less controversial differences. The woman who had been mocked for her accent was about to discover whether she had the courage to reveal an even more extraordinary difference that could save lives at the cost of her career. Elena stood in the FBI field office bathroom at 4:23 a.m., staring at her reflection in the fluorescent-lit mirror, while 17 murdered women whispered urgent warnings in her mind. Their voices had reached a crescendo of desperation, speaking in overlapping dialects that painted a terrifying picture of Dr. Herbert Manning's immediate plans. According to the dead, he was currently loading accelerants into his van outside a storage facility in Henrico County, preparing to destroy 4 decades of evidence, before eliminating the 3 living witnesses who could connect him to the murders. The bathroom door opened and Agent Sarah Richmond entered, her usually pristine appearance disheveled from the all-night investigation. She barely acknowledged Elena's presence as she splashed cold water on her face, muttering about the career implications of failing to catch a serial killer who had been operating under their noses for decades. "This is going to destroy us all," Richmond said to her reflection. "Manning consulted on 12 of my cases. Every profile I've written, every behavioral analysis I've presented to prosecutors, all of it based on insights from the actual killer. My credibility is finished." Elena felt a surge of bitter irony. Richmond was worried about professional embarrassment, while Manning was preparing to murder 3 more people within the next 6 hours. The voices were providing Elena with specific details. Manning's first target was Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a forensic psychiatrist who had recently questioned some of his psychological assessments. She was currently asleep in her apartment on Monument Avenue, completely unaware that her former colleague was planning to eliminate her as a potential threat. Returning to the main office, Elena found the investigative team struggling with conventional law enforcement limitations. Agent Brooks was coordinating with local police to establish surveillance on Manning's known addresses, but bureaucratic procedures were moving too slowly to prevent immediate violence. Search warrants required judicial approval that could take hours to obtain, while Manning was implementing escape plans that had been decades in preparation. Dr. Marcus Thornfield sat surrounded by Manning's consultation files, his academic arrogance replaced by professional humiliation. "He played us perfectly," Thornfield admitted to Agent Foster. "Every psychological insight, every behavioral prediction, Manning was essentially writing his own profile while steering our investigation away from productive leads. He even recommended investigative strategies that would waste resources on false patterns." Elena approached Thornfield's workspace, her mind racing through possibilities for translating supernatural intelligence into actionable information.
The voices were providing her with detailed descriptions of Manning's storage facility, including the specific unit number and the types of evidence he had preserved as trophies. But revealing this information would require explanations that could destroy her career and potentially compromise the entire investigation. Dr. Thornfield, Elena said carefully, I've been analyzing linguistic patterns in the original Riverside case files, focusing on communications attributed to the killer. There are dialectological indicators that suggest the perpetrator had extensive exposure to regional speech variations across multiple states. Thornfield looked up from Manning's files with an expression of desperate hope. Any new analytical approach might provide leads that conventional investigation had missed. What kind of indicators, Vasquez? Elena had spent years developing techniques for presenting supernatural insights as academic analysis. Her doctoral research provided legitimate cover for information that actually came from communication with the dead. The killer's written communications show familiarity with speech patterns from Appalachian, Tidewater, and Piedmont communities spanning 4 decades. This suggests either extensive travel or professional exposure to diverse populations, characteristics consistent with someone in a consulting role. It was a carefully constructed half-truth that pointed investigators towards Manning, without revealing Elena's actual source of information. But the voices were becoming more urgent, warning that Manning was accelerating his timeline. Dr. Walsh had less than 3 hours before Manning reached her apartment, while the storage facility could be destroyed within the next 90 minutes. Agent Foster was reviewing Manning's consultation history when he made a connection that validated Elena's linguistic analysis. Vasquez might be onto something. Manning could be onto something. Manning consulted on cases in West Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky, exactly the regions where those dialect patterns would be most prevalent. He could have developed familiarity with regional speech through professional travel. Elena felt a surge of desperate inspiration. If she could convince the team to investigate the storage facility based on linguistic analysis, they might discover Manning's evidence archive before he could destroy it. But she needed a plausible reason for focusing on that specific location without revealing supernatural communication. Agent Brooks, Elena said, approaching the unit chief's desk where she was coordinating with local law enforcement. My analysis of Manning's consultation patterns suggests he would require a private workspace for developing psychological profiles. Someone with his methodical approach would likely maintain extensive files and reference materials outside his official office.
Brooks looked up from her coordination calls with an expression of professional skepticism. Vasquez, we're already checking Manning's known addresses. His home and office are under surveillance, but he hasn't appeared at either location. Elena took a breath that felt like jumping off a cliff. Agent Brooks, I believe Manning may be using a storage facility in Henrico County. My linguistic analysis suggests he has detailed knowledge of that area's speech patterns, and the facility would provide the privacy necessary for his activities. The statement was professional suicide if she couldn't provide adequate justification, but the voices were describing Manning's current actions in real time. He was pouring gasoline over filing cabinets filled with victim photographs, personal effects, and recorded confessions that would finally prove his guilt beyond any doubt. Agent Richmond looked up from her case files with obvious suspicion. Vasquez, what specific linguistic evidence points to a storage facility in Henrico County? That's an incredibly precise geographic prediction based on dialect analysis. Elena felt the familiar chill that preceded her most desperate professional gambles. The killer's communications include references to industrial terminology and storage-related vocabulary that suggests familiarity with warehouse environments. Combined with speech patterns specific to eastern Henrico County, this points towards someone who spends significant time in that area's commercial storage district. It was elaborate academic fiction designed to mask supernatural intelligence, but Elena knew that Manning's evidence archive was too valuable to lose. The voices were describing materials that would connect him to dozens of murders beyond the confirmed cases, providing closure for families who had spent decades wondering about missing loved ones. Dr. Thornfield stood up from his desk with sudden excitement. Brooks, Vasquez's analysis makes sense. Manning's psychological profiles always included unusual attention to environmental details and spatial relationships. If he's been documenting his crimes for 40 years, he would need secure storage space outside his normal living and working areas. Elena felt a moment of professional vindication mixed with supernatural terror. Her academic reputation was providing cover for information that came from communication with the dead. But the success of this deception was secondary to preventing Manning's escape and the murders he was planning. Agent Brooks made the decision that would define the next phase of the investigation. Foster, coordinate with Henrico County Police to identify storage facilities in the Eastern District. Richmond, get me search warrant applications for any facilities connected to Manning or his known associates. Vasquez, I want you analyzing any written materials we recover for linguistic patterns that might identify additional crime scenes. The team moved with federal efficiency, but Elena knew they were operating against a timeline that conventional investigation couldn't meet. Manning was currently driving toward Dr. Walsh's apartment, while federal agents struggled with legal procedures and administrative coordination. The voices were providing Elena with a running commentary on his approach route, describing the weapons he had prepared and the specific methods he planned to use. Elena found herself in the impossible position of possessing information that could save lives while being unable to act on it directly. She could warn Dr. Walsh about the immediate threat, but doing so would require explanations that would end her career and possibly result in psychiatric evaluation. Federal law enforcement couldn't officially act on tips from people claiming to communicate with murder victims. The breakthrough came when Agent Foster received a call from Henrico County Police. Brooks, we've got a match. Manning rented a storage unit under an assumed name at the Eastgate Storage Complex 18 months ago. The facility manager confirms he's been there tonight, arriving around 3 a.m. with accelerants and what appeared to be gasoline containers. Elena felt a surge of supernatural validation mixed with desperate urgency. The voices had been accurate about Manning's location and activities, which meant their warnings about his planned murders were equally reliable. Dr. Walsh had less than 2 hours before Manning reached her apartment, while the evidence destruction was already underway. Agent Brooks was coordinating the tactical response when Elena made a decision that would change everything. She approached the unit chief's desk with an expression of academic concern that masked desperate supernatural knowledge. Agent Brooks, based on my analysis of Manning's behavioral patterns, I believe he poses an immediate threat to specific individuals who might compromise his escape plans. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, in particular, recently questioned his psychological assessments in ways that could expose his deception. Brooks looked up from her tactical planning with sharp attention. Vasquez, what makes you think Manning would target Walsh specifically? Elena felt herself crossing a line that separated conventional investigation from supernatural intervention. Agent Brooks, my analysis of Manning's consultation files shows a pattern of eliminating professional critics through methods that appear accidental or natural. Dr. Walsh's recent challenges to his work would make her a logical target for elimination. It was the most dangerous professional gamble Elena had ever attempted. She was essentially predicting a specific murder based on communication with the dead, disguising supernatural intelligence as academic analysis. If she was wrong, her career would be destroyed. If she was right but couldn't explain her knowledge adequately, the results would be equally catastrophic. Agent Richmond stood up from her desk with obvious suspicion. Vasquez, you're suggesting that Manning is planning to murder Dr. Walsh based on linguistic analysis of his professional correspondence? That's an extraordinary leap from dialectological research to predicting violent behavior. Elena realized she had reached the moment that would define not only her career but her moral responsibility to the living and the dead. The voices were describing Manning's current location. He was parked outside Dr. Walsh's apartment, preparing weapons and surveillance equipment for a carefully planned murder that would appear to be a random home invasion. Agent Richmond, Elena said with quiet desperation, sometimes linguistic analysis reveals patterns that conventional behavioral profiling misses.
Manning's communications show escalating paranoia about professional challenges to his authority. Dr. Walsh represents a direct threat to the reputation he spent decades building. Agent Brooks made the decision that would save Dr. Walsh's life. Foster, coordinate with Richmond Police to provide protective surveillance for Dr. Walsh immediately. I want units at her residence within 15 minutes, and I want her contacted about the potential threat to her safety. Elena felt a surge of relief that was immediately tempered by awareness that Manning had 2 other planned victims whose identities the voices were still revealing. The supernatural intelligence was providing her with information that could prevent multiple murders, but each revelation required increasingly elaborate deceptions to translate into conventional investigative action. The tactical team was preparing to storm Manning's storage facility when Elena received the most urgent supernatural warning yet. The voices were describing Manning's reaction to police sirens approaching Dr. Walsh's apartment. He was abandoning his planned murder and accelerating his timeline for destroying evidence and eliminating the remaining witnesses on his list. Elena approached Agent Brooks one final time, knowing that her next statement would either complete her transformation from marginalized academic to essential investigator or destroy her career in spectacular fashion. "Agent Brooks," she said quietly, "Manning knows we're closing in. Based on my analysis of his behavioral patterns and current circumstances, he's going to abandon his systematic approach and attempt to eliminate all threats immediately. We have perhaps 30 minutes before he destroys evidence that could solve dozens of murders and provide closure for families who have waited decades for answers." Brooks looked at Elena with an expression that mixed professional respect with obvious confusion about how linguistic analysis could provide such specific tactical intelligence. But the accuracy of Elena's previous predictions had established credibility that conventional academic credentials couldn't match. "Vasquez, are you absolutely certain about this timeline?" Elena felt the weight of 17 murdered women's voices urging her towards complete honesty. "Agent Brooks, I'm certain that Manning represents an immediate threat to evidence preservation and witness safety. Every minute we delay increases the risk that he'll successfully destroy materials that could revolutionize our understanding of serial murder behavior and provide justice for victims whose cases have remained unsolved for decades."
It was the closest Elena could come to revealing the supernatural source of her intelligence without completely abandoning the academic cover that had made her involvement possible. She was walking a tightrope between professional survival and moral responsibility, knowing that the next hour would determine whether her extraordinary abilities would finally serve justice or remain forever hidden beneath institutional skepticism. The tactical van raced through Richmond's pre-dawn streets toward the Eastgate storage complex, while Elena sat surrounded by federal agents who had no idea she was receiving real-time intelligence from 17 murdered women. Through her earpiece, she could hear Agent Brooks coordinating with SWAT teams, bomb disposal units, and forensic specialists who were preparing for what could be the most significant serial killer evidence recovery in FBI history. But the voices in Elena's mind were providing her with moment-by-moment updates on Dr. Herbert Manning's desperate attempts to destroy 40 years of meticulously documented murder. Agent Foster sat across from Elena in the van's cramped interior, reviewing tactical plans on a tablet that displayed the storage facility's layout. "Vasquez, once we secure the scene, I need you to analyze any written materials we recover. If Manning has been documenting his crimes for 4 decades, there could be linguistic evidence connecting him to unsolved cases across multiple states." Elena nodded while internally processing the supernatural intelligence that was streaming through her consciousness like a horrific documentary. The voices were describing Manning's current actions with devastating clarity. He was standing in Storage Unit 247, systematically feeding photographs and personal effects into a metal drum where accelerants had created a raging fire. Each item represented a life stolen and a family destroyed, evidence that could finally provide closure being consumed by flames fed by panic and desperation. The lead voice belonged to Catherine Morrison, Manning's first victim from 1978, whose distinctive Tidewater dialect carried the authority of someone who had been waiting 45 years for justice. She was providing Elena with detailed descriptions of the storage unit's contents, identifying which materials Manning was destroying and which evidence remained intact in fireproof filing cabinets that he hadn't yet accessed. "Elena," Catherine's voice whispered with urgent clarity, "he's got recordings of everything, hours of audio documentation where he describes each murder in detail, including victims we haven't told you about yet. But he's moving toward the fireproof cabinets now, and once those are opened, everything will be lost forever." Agent Sarah Richmond was reviewing Manning's psychological profiles when she made an observation that sent chills through the tactical team. His consultation work gave him detailed knowledge of evidence preservation techniques and investigative procedures. If he's been planning for this possibility, he'll have developed methods for destroying materials that would normally survive standard fires. Elena felt the supernatural urgency intensifying as the voices describing Manning's sophisticated destruction protocols. He had prepared thermite charges that could melt steel filing cabinets and industrial incinerators capable of reducing organic materials to untraceable ash. The storage unit was essentially an evidence destruction laboratory designed to eliminate any proof of his 4-decade murder spree. The van arrived at the storage facility as dawn began breaking over Richmond's eastern suburbs. The Eastgate complex was a sprawling collection of corrugated metal buildings arranged in a grid pattern that provided multiple escape routes for anyone familiar with the layout. Smoke was visible rising from the rear section where Manning's unit was located, confirming the voice's warnings about ongoing evidence destruction. Dr. Marcus Thornfield emerged from the command vehicle with an expression that mixed professional determination with personal humiliation. As the unit's senior profiler, he had relied on Manning's insights for over a decade, unknowingly collaborating with the very killer he was attempting to capture. His entire career in behavioral analysis was built on foundations that Manning had carefully constructed to mislead federal investigations. "Vasquez," Thornfield said as Elena exited the tactical van, "I need you to understand something. If Manning has been documenting his crimes for 40 years, the linguistic evidence could revolutionize our understanding of serial killer psychology. Your analysis could provide insights that reshape investigative techniques for decades to come." Elena felt the weight of supernatural responsibility settling over her like a suffocating blanket. The voices were providing her with information that could indeed revolutionize criminal investigation, but only if she could find ways to present supernatural intelligence as conventional academic analysis. The dead were offering to guide federal agents to evidence locations and provide detailed accounts of crimes that conventional investigation could never uncover. The SWAT team leader, Captain Rodriguez, briefed the assembled agents on tactical procedures, while Elena listened to supernatural warnings about Manning's defensive preparations. According to the voices, he had positioned explosive devices near the storage unit's entrance and was monitoring police communications through scanner equipment that allowed him to track their approach. "Manning knows standard law enforcement protocols better than most federal agents," Catherine's voice warned. "He's been studying tactical procedures for decades and has prepared countermeasures specifically designed to prevent evidence recovery. But he doesn't know about us, Elena. He can't hear our warnings or anticipate our guidance." Agent Brooks was coordinating with the bomb disposal unit when Elena made a decision that would either save lives or destroy her career. She approached the unit chief with an expression of academic concern that masked desperate supernatural knowledge. "Agent Brooks, based on my analysis of Manning's consultation files, I believe he's prepared defensive measures that account for standard tactical approaches. His psychological profile suggests paranoid preparation spanning decades, including contingency plans for evidence destruction and law enforcement confrontation." Brooks turned from her with sharp attention. "Vasquez, what specific defensive measures are you predicting based on linguistic analysis?" Elena felt herself crossing another line between conventional investigation and supernatural intervention.
Agent Brooks, Manning's written communications show familiarity with explosive terminology and demolition procedures that suggest technical expertise beyond psychological consultation. I believe he's prepared devices designed to destroy evidence if law enforcement attempts direct assault on the storage facility. It was another elaborate deception designed to translate supernatural warnings into actionable intelligence. The voices were describing Manning's specific explosive placements and electronic trigger systems, providing Elena with tactical information that could prevent casualties among the response team. Captain Rodriguez reviewed Elena's assessment with the professional skepticism of someone who had conducted hundreds of tactical operations. Dr. Vasquez, explosive booby traps require sophisticated technical knowledge and expensive materials. What makes you think a forensic psychologist would have those capabilities? Elena realized she was approaching the limits of what academic analysis could plausibly predict. But the voices were describing Manning's preparations with technical precision that suggested years of planning and professional-grade equipment. Captain Rodriguez, Elena said carefully, Manning's consultation work included cases involving bombers and domestic terrorists. His access to classified investigative materials would have provided detailed information about explosive devices and defensive techniques. Someone with his methodical approach would certainly have developed practical applications for that theoretical knowledge. The explanation was academically plausible while pointing investigators toward tactical caution that could save lives. But Elena knew she was walking an increasingly narrow tightrope between professional credibility and supernatural revelation.
Agent Foster was analyzing the storage facility's layout when he discovered information that validated Elena's warnings. Brooks, Manning's rental agreement shows he specifically requested a unit with electrical access and climate control systems. That level of infrastructure would support sophisticated equipment beyond simple storage needs. Elena felt a surge of vindication that was immediately overshadowed by escalating supernatural urgency. The voices were describing Manning's current actions as he activated final destruction protocols. Thermite charges were beginning to heat fireproof cabinets while industrial fans spread accelerants throughout the storage unit. Elena, Catherine's voice carried desperate urgency. He's activating the destruction sequence now. In 15 minutes, everything will be gone forever. But there's something he doesn't know. Unit 248 next door contains backup materials he stored separately. If your people can reach that unit before the fire spreads, they'll find evidence that connects him to over 60 murders across 12 states. Elena faced the most critical decision of her life. The voices were providing her with information that could save decades of evidence and solve dozens of murders. But revealing this intelligence would require explanations that would end her career and possibly result in psychiatric commitment. She had to choose between professional survival and moral responsibility to victims whose voices only she could hear. The bomb disposal team was preparing to approach Manning's unit when Elena made her final gamble. She approached Agent Brooks with an expression of academic certainty that masked supernatural desperation. Agent Brooks, I need to tell you something that my linguistic analysis has revealed about Manning's storage patterns. Based on his methodical personality and paranoid preparation, he would never risk storing all his materials in a single location. There's almost certainly a secondary storage unit containing backup evidence. Brooks paused in her tactical coordination to focus on Elena's prediction. Vasquez, what specific evidence suggests a secondary storage location? Elena felt the supernatural voices urging her toward complete honesty, but she maintained her academic facade through sheer professional discipline. Agent Brooks, Manning's consultation files reference organizational redundancy and risk management strategies that suggest someone obsessed with preserving materials against potential discovery. The adjacent storage unit would provide the security and accessibility he requires. It was the most dangerous professional deception Elena had ever attempted. She was essentially claiming that academic analysis could predict the specific location of evidence that could solve dozens of murders, disguising supernatural intelligence as scholarly insight. Agent Richmond looked up from her coordination duties with obvious suspicion. Vasquez, you're suggesting that linguistic analysis can identify the exact location of a serial killer's backup evidence? That's beyond the scope of dialectological research. Elena realized she had reached the moment where academic cover stories would either hold or collapse completely. The voices were describing the contents of Unit 248 in detail. Filing cabinets filled with victim photographs, audio recordings of confessions, and personal effects from over 60 murders spanning 4 decades. Agent Richmond, Elena said with quiet desperation, sometimes patterns revealed through linguistic analysis provide insights that conventional investigation misses. Manning's communications show obsessive attention to detail and systematic redundancy that would naturally extend to evidence preservation. Dr. Thornfield stood up from his analysis station with sudden excitement. Brooks, Vasquez's assessment matches established patterns in serial killer behavior. Organized offenders frequently maintain multiple evidence caches as insurance against discovery. If Manning has been operating for 40 years, backup storage would be essential for his psychological needs. Elena felt a moment of academic vindication that was immediately overshadowed by supernatural urgency. The voices were warning that Manning had detected police communications and was accelerating his destruction timeline. The thermite charges in Unit 247 were reaching temperatures that would destroy even fireproof containers within minutes. Agent Brooks made the decision that would determine whether decades of evidence survived or disappeared forever. Rodriguez, split your team. Primary assault on Unit 247 to apprehend Manning and preserve whatever evidence remains. Secondary team secures Unit 248 based on Dr. Vasquez's analysis. The tactical teams moved with federal precision, while Elena watched through supernatural eyes as Manning realized his backup storage had been discovered. The voices described his panic as he attempted to trigger remote destruction devices for Unit 248, only to discover that federal agents had already disabled his electronic systems. The confrontation reached its climax when SWAT officers breached Unit 247 to find Manning standing amid flames and molten metal. His appearance shocked the tactical team. The distinguished forensic psychologist had been transformed into a disheveled figure whose eyes carried the madness of someone watching 40 years of meticulous planning collapse around him. Dr. Herbert Manning, Captain Rodriguez announced through tactical speakers, you are under arrest for multiple counts of murder. Drop any weapons and exit the storage unit immediately. Manning's response was captured on tactical audio equipment that recorded his final confession as federal agents closed in. You don't understand what you're destroying, he screamed over the roar of flames. I documented everything, every victim, every technique, every psychological development across 40 years of research. This was the most comprehensive study of serial murder behavior ever conducted. Elena heard the voices of 17 women responding to Manning's characterization of their deaths as research. Their combined fury created a supernatural crescendo that nearly overwhelmed her consciousness, as they demanded justice for decades of systematic torture and murder disguised as academic study. The tactical team secured both storage units, while forensic specialists worked desperately to preserve evidence that Manning had spent hours trying to destroy. Unit 248 yielded exactly what the voices had promised. Filing cabinets filled with materials connecting Manning to dozens of unsolved murders across multiple states and decades. Agent Brooks approached Elena as forensic teams cataloged evidence that would reshape the FBI's understanding of serial killer behavior. Vasquez, your linguistic analysis was instrumental in recovering materials that would have been lost forever. How did you know to look in Unit 248? Elena faced the question that would define her future with federal law enforcement. She could maintain her academic deception and accept credit for insights that actually came from communication with the dead. Or she could risk everything by revealing the supernatural source of her intelligence. The voices were silent now, their urgent warnings replaced by a sense of peaceful resolution. 17 murdered women had finally been heard. Their desperate communications translated into justice that had eluded conventional investigation for decades. Agent Brooks, Elena said quietly, sometimes the most important evidence comes from sources that conventional investigation overlooks. The victims in this case had stories to tell, and my job was simply to listen carefully to understand what they were trying to communicate. It was the closest Elena could come to honesty without completely abandoning the professional credibility that had made her involvement possible.
But as Manning was led away in restraints, still screaming about his research being misunderstood, Elena realized that her confrontation with institutional prejudice was just beginning. The woman who had been mocked for her accent had proven her value to federal law enforcement. But the true test would come when she attempted to use her extraordinary abilities to reshape investigative procedures throughout the criminal justice system. The FBI's Evidence Analysis Center in Quantico had never processed a discovery of this magnitude. Elena stood in the secured examination room, surrounded by materials recovered from Dr. Herbert Manning's storage units, while forensic specialists worked around the clock to catalog evidence that would rewrite the history of American serial murder. What they had initially believed was a decades-old cold case had revealed itself as the most comprehensive documentation of systematic killing ever discovered, spanning 43 years and connecting to unsolved murders across 14 states.
Agent Patricia Brooks approached Elena's workstation carrying preliminary analysis reports that painted a picture of criminal sophistication beyond anything federal law enforcement had previously encountered. Manning hadn't simply been killing women. He had been conducting a longitudinal study of murder methodology, psychological development, and law enforcement response patterns that represented a twisted form of academic research funded by decades of violence. Vasquez, what we're seeing here changes everything we thought we knew about serial killer behavior, Brooks said, spreading crime scene photographs across the analysis table. Manning hadn't simply been killing women. He had been documenting a longitudinal study of murder methodology, psychological development, and law enforcement response patterns that represented a twisted form of academic research funded by decades of violence. Vasquez, what we're seeing here changes everything we thought we knew about serial killer behavior, Brooks said, spreading crime scene photographs across the analysis table. Manning documented his evolution from impulsive rage-driven murders in the 1970s to sophisticated psychological manipulation in the 2000s. He essentially created a 4-decade curriculum in homicide, with each victim serving as both subject and teacher. Elena studied the materials while listening to supernatural voices that were now providing historical context for Manning's documented crimes. The 17 women from the burial site had been joined by dozens of additional victims whose voices created a chorus of testimony spanning multiple generations. Each spirit spoke in the dialect of their time and region, creating a linguistic timeline that paralleled Manning's geographical movements and methodological evolution. The voice of Rebecca Patterson, murdered in 1983, spoke with the distinctive accent of rural North Carolina while describing Manning's transition from opportunistic predator to methodical researcher. Elena, he changed after the 5th year, started taking notes during the killings, recording our voices as we died. Said he was studying the psychological progression from terror to acceptance, documenting how different personalities responded to certain death. Dr. Marcus Thornfield was reviewing Manning's consultation files when he discovered the true scope of the deception that had compromised federal investigations for decades. Brooks, Manning didn't just use his position to monitor our investigations, he actively shaped them. Look at these psychological profiles he provided for the Sacramento Strangler case in 1995. He steered investigators away from suspects who matched his actual methodology while encouraging focus on behavioral patterns that were completely fabricated. Elena felt a chill of recognition as the voices confirmed Thornfield's discovery. Manning had been operating as a criminal consultant to law enforcement while simultaneously using that access to perfect his killing techniques and avoid detection. His psychological profiles had been based on intimate knowledge of serial murder methodology because he was analyzing his own behavior while disguising it as academic research. Agent Sarah Richmond was coordinating with field offices across multiple states when the scope of Manning's influence became fully apparent. Brooks, we've got a problem that goes far beyond the murders. Manning consulted on over 200 cases during his career, providing behavioral analysis and investigation strategies that shaped major serial killer investigations from coast to coast. If his insights were deliberately misleading, we're looking at compromised cases spanning 3 decades. The revelation sent shockwaves through the federal law enforcement community. Manning's reputation as a leading expert in serial killer psychology had made his insights influential in training programs, investigative protocols, and even academic research conducted by legitimate scholars. His deliberate misinformation had shaped an entire generation of federal agents' understanding of criminal behavior patterns. Elena was analyzing Manning's audio recordings when she discovered something that made her blood run cold. The tapes contained not only confessions and victim testimonies, but detailed conversations where Manning discussed his observations with unidentified collaborators. He hadn't been working alone. The 4-decade murder spree had involved at least 3 other individuals who had helped with victim selection, evidence disposal, and law enforcement manipulation. Agent Brooks, Elena said carefully, Manning's recorded materials reference collaborators who assisted with various aspects of his operations. The linguistic patterns suggest at least 3 different individuals with distinct regional accents and professional vocabularies. Brooks looked up from her case coordination with sharp attention. Vasquez, are you saying Manning had accomplices in the murders? Elena felt the supernatural voices urging her toward revelations that would expose a criminal conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of the criminal justice system. Agent Brooks, the recordings indicate collaboration with individuals who had access to law enforcement databases, forensic laboratories, and judicial proceedings. Manning couldn't have maintained his operations for 4 decades without inside assistance from people in positions of institutional authority. The implication was staggering. Manning's murder spree had been enabled by corrupt officials within the very system designed to stop him. Law enforcement personnel, forensic specialists, and possibly even prosecutors had participated in covering up evidence and misdirecting investigations to protect a killer whose work they viewed as valuable research. Agent Foster was reviewing Manning's financial records when he discovered evidence that confirmed Elena's analysis. Brooks, Manning received payments from multiple government agencies and private research institutions for consultation work that now appears to have been based on his direct experience as a serial killer. He was essentially being paid to provide insights derived from murdering American citizens. Elena heard the voice of Susan Martinez, murdered in 1999, speaking with the accent of urban California while describing Manning's network of collaborators. Elena, there was a forensic lab technician who helped destroy DNA evidence, a police detective who ensured certain cases never received adequate investigation, and a prosecutor who made sure potential witnesses were discredited before they could testify. They called themselves researchers and said they were advancing criminal psychology through practical experimentation. The supernatural intelligence was revealing a conspiracy that reached far beyond a single serial killer into the foundations of American criminal justice. Elena realized she was uncovering evidence of systematic corruption that had allowed Manning to operate with virtual impunity while contributing to the very system that should have stopped him. Dr. Thornfield was reviewing academic publications when he made a discovery that exposed the full extent of Manning's influence on criminal psychology research. Brooks, Manning co-authored papers with leading researchers at major universities, sharing insights that were apparently based on his direct experience murdering people. His work influenced FBI training programs, police academy curricula, and graduate-level courses in criminal behavior analysis. Elena felt the weight of institutional betrayal settling over the investigation like a suffocating blanket. Manning's crimes had been hidden in plain sight, disguised as legitimate academic research and professional consultation. The very experts who should have recognized his patterns had instead celebrated his insights as breakthrough contributions to understanding serial killer psychology. Agent Richmond was coordinating with the Department of Justice when she received information that expanded the investigation beyond anything the Richmond field office had ever handled. Brooks, the DOJ wants a complete review of every case Manning touched during his career. We're looking at potential hundreds of compromised investigations, wrongful convictions based on his fabricated profiles, and legitimate killers who escaped justice because Manning steered investigators toward false leads. The scope of required investigation was overwhelming. Manning's deliberate misinformation had created a cascade of investigative failures that would take years to untangle. Elena realized that her supernatural abilities had uncovered not just a serial killer, but a systematic corruption of the criminal justice system that had allowed countless criminals to escape accountability. Elena was analyzing Manning's correspondence when she discovered communications that revealed the true motivation behind his 4-decade murder spree. The letters discussed plans for publishing comprehensive research on serial killer psychology based on direct observational data that would revolutionize the field of criminal behavior analysis. Manning and his collaborators had been planning to reveal their work as legitimate academic research once they had accumulated sufficient data through systematic murder. "Agent Brooks," Elena said quietly, "Manning's correspondence suggests he was planning to publish his research openly, presenting 4 decades of murder as legitimate academic study. His collaborators believed they were participating in groundbreaking research that would advance criminal psychology beyond conventional theoretical limitations." Brooks paused in her coordination calls to focus on Elena's discovery. "Vasquez, are you saying Manning planned to admit to the murders publicly?" Elena felt the supernatural voices confirming the horrific scope of Manning's ambitions. "Agent Brooks, the correspondence indicates plans for academic publication that would have presented systematic murder as ethical research methodology. Manning believed his work represented a new paradigm in criminal psychology that justified the deaths of over 60 women as necessary sacrifices for advancing human knowledge." The revelation exposed the ultimate arrogance of Manning's conspiracy. He and his collaborators had convinced themselves that murder was justifiable if it contributed to academic understanding of criminal behavior. They had transformed systematic killing into a research project, believing that future contributions to criminal psychology would retroactively justify their victims' deaths. Agent Foster was reviewing institutional connections when he discovered evidence that Manning's network had infiltrated multiple federal agencies. "Brooks, we've got communications indicating collaboration with personnel in FBI behavioral analysis, ATF forensic laboratories, and even Department of Justice prosecution units. This conspiracy reached into every level of federal law enforcement." Elena heard the voices of murdered women describing their killers' discussions about career advancement and professional recognition that would come from publishing research based on systematic murder. The conspiracy members had viewed their participation in mass murder as an investment in academic careers that would be built on the corpses of their victims. The voice of Jennifer Walsh, the forensic psychiatrist who had been Manning's planned final victim, joined the supernatural chorus even though she was still alive. Elena realized that the near-death experience of Manning's attack had somehow opened her consciousness to communication with the murder victims. Walsh's voice carried contemporary professional vocabulary while describing Manning's plans for publishing comprehensive research that would have established him as the preeminent expert on serial killer psychology. "Elena," Walsh's voice said with clinical precision, "Manning showed me his publication timeline during the attack. He planned to wait until all potential witnesses were dead, then reveal his research as a breakthrough study that would reshape criminal psychology forever. He believed academic recognition would justify everything he had done." Elena found herself processing supernatural intelligence that revealed the true scope of Manning's ambitions while struggling to translate this information into conventional investigative insights. The conspiracy had been designed to corrupt American criminal justice from within, using academic respectability to disguise systematic murder while advancing the careers of participants through insights derived from their victims' deaths. Agent Brooks was coordinating with congressional oversight committees when she received notification that the Manning investigation had attracted attention from the highest levels of the federal government. "Vasquez, the Senate Judiciary Committee is demanding immediate briefings about the extent of law enforcement corruption this case has revealed. Your linguistic analysis is going to be crucial for identifying other personnel who might have been compromised by Manning's network." Elena realized that her supernatural abilities had uncovered a conspiracy that threatened the credibility of American criminal justice at the highest levels. The voices of murdered women had revealed systematic corruption that would require congressional investigation and complete restructuring of federal law enforcement agencies to address. But the most disturbing revelation was still to come. As Elena analyzed Manning's final recordings, she discovered evidence that his research project was designed to continue even after his capture.
His collaborators had been instructed to maintain detailed documentation of law enforcement response to his exposure, treating the investigation itself as additional data for their academic research. Agent Brooks, Elena said with growing horror, Manning's network is still active. They're documenting our investigation as part of their research, studying how law enforcement responds to the discovery of systematic corruption within criminal justice institutions. The conspiracy was still operating, using Manning's capture as an opportunity to study federal law enforcement from the inside while planning their next phase of research that might involve even more systematic murder disguised as academic study. Elena realized that exposing Manning had only revealed the tip of an iceberg that threatened to sink public confidence in American criminal justice forever.
The voices of 63 murdered women were now speaking in unison, providing Elena with a supernatural mandate that transcended professional obligations or career considerations. They had waited decades for someone who could hear their testimony and translate it into justice that conventional investigation had failed to achieve. As federal agents worked through the night cataloging evidence that would reshape American law enforcement, Elena prepared for the most challenging phase of her involvement in the case. The woman who had been mocked for her accent was about to use her extraordinary abilities to expose corruption that reached into the highest levels of the criminal justice system, knowing that her supernatural insights would either transform federal law enforcement or destroy her career in the most spectacular way possible. The Hart Senate Office Building's secure hearing room buzzed with tension as congressional investigators prepared to question FBI personnel about the most extensive corruption scandal in federal law enforcement history. Elena sat at the witness table, her hands steady despite knowing that her testimony would either revolutionize criminal investigation or destroy her career in the most public way possible. Around her, senators and representatives shuffled through classified briefings that detailed how Dr. Herbert Manning's network had compromised American criminal justice for over 4 decades. Senator Catherine Mills, chairwoman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, called the emergency session to order with the gravity of someone presiding over institutional collapse. The preliminary investigation had revealed corruption reaching into the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, the Department of Justice's Criminal Division, and even federal judicial appointments that Manning's network had influenced through academic connections and professional recommendations. Dr. Vasquez, Senator Mills began, her voice carrying the weight of constitutional responsibility. Your analysis of the Manning case has uncovered evidence suggesting systematic corruption within federal law enforcement agencies. Before we proceed, I want you to understand that your testimony today will be classified at the highest levels and may influence criminal prosecutions affecting hundreds of federal personnel. Elena felt the familiar presence of supernatural voices as 63 murdered women prepared to have their testimony heard by the highest levels of American government. The spirits spoke in overlapping dialects that created a linguistic timeline spanning 43 years of systematic murder, each voice carrying evidence that conventional investigation had failed to discover for decades. The voice of Catherine Morrison, Manning's first victim from 1978, provided Elena with supernatural guidance as she prepared to navigate the most dangerous testimony of her career. Elena, tell them about the recordings we showed you, the ones where Manning's collaborators discuss eliminating federal agents who got too close to discovering their network. They're planning to continue their research by studying how law enforcement responds to internal corruption. Elena realized she was facing an impossible choice between revealing supernatural sources that would end her credibility or hiding evidence that could save lives and preserve American democracy. The voices were providing her with intelligence about active threats to federal agents, congressional investigators, and even Supreme Court justices who had been targeted for elimination by Manning's surviving collaborators. Representative James Chen, ranking minority member of the House Intelligence Committee, leaned forward with obvious skepticism about Elena's unconventional methods. Dr. Vasquez, your linguistic analysis has provided extraordinary insights into criminal behavior patterns. But some of your predictions seem to exceed the scope of academic research. How do you explain the precision of your investigative guidance? Elena felt herself approaching the moment that would define not only her career, but the future of criminal investigation in America. The supernatural voices were urging her toward complete honesty, arguing that conventional law enforcement had proven inadequate to address the scope of corruption that Manning's network represented.
Senator Mills, Representative Chen, Elena said carefully, "My analysis of the Manning case has revealed communication patterns that suggest ongoing criminal activity by surviving network members. Based on linguistic evidence recovered from Manning's recordings, I believe federal personnel involved in this investigation are currently at risk of targeted elimination." It was another elaborate deception designed to translate supernatural warnings into conventional intelligence assessments. But Elena knew she was walking an increasingly narrow path between professional survival and moral responsibility to both the living and the dead. Senator Mills consulted classified briefings that contained Elena's preliminary analysis of Manning's network structure. "Dr. Vasquez, your assessment suggests that Manning's collaborators have infiltrated federal agencies at levels requiring security clearances and administrative authority. Can you identify specific individuals who might pose ongoing threats to federal operations?" Elena felt the supernatural voices, providing her with names, locations, and current activities of Manning's surviving collaborators. The spirits described ongoing meetings where network members planned to eliminate investigators while continuing their research through systematic murder of federal personnel whose deaths would be studied as additional data points. But revealing this information would require explanations that Elena couldn't provide without admitting to supernatural communication. She had reached the limits of what academic analysis could plausibly predict while facing moral responsibility that demanded action regardless of professional consequences. "Senator Mills," Elena said quietly, "the linguistic patterns in Manning's recordings suggest active coordination among surviving network members who view this investigation as an opportunity for additional research. They're studying federal law enforcement response patterns while planning to eliminate personnel who pose threats to their continued operations." Representative Sarah Davidson, a former federal prosecutor herself, interrupted with sharp legal insight. "Dr. Vasquez, you're essentially predicting specific criminal activity based on linguistic analysis of historical recordings. That exceeds any reasonable academic methodology unless you have access to current intelligence that you haven't disclosed to this committee." Elena realized she had been cornered by someone with sufficient legal experience to recognize the impossibility of her claims. Representative Davidson was demanding explanations that Elena couldn't provide without revealing supernatural abilities that would destroy her credibility and end her involvement in preventing future murders. The moment was interrupted when Agent Patricia Brooks entered the hearing room carrying urgent intelligence reports that validated Elena's warnings in the most dramatic way possible. "Senator Mills, we have confirmation of threats against federal personnel involved in the Manning investigation. 3 agents have been targeted for elimination, and we've intercepted communications indicating plans for systematic attacks on congressional investigators." Elena felt a surge of vindication mixed with terror as the supernatural voices proved accurate once again. But she also realized that her credibility was becoming impossible to maintain through conventional explanations. Each accurate prediction made her claims more valuable to law enforcement while making her methods more suspicious to institutional oversight. Senator Mills reviewed the intelligence briefings with growing alarm. "Agent Brooks, what specific evidence confirms Dr. Vasquez's assessment of ongoing threats?" Brooks consulted classified reports that Elena knew contained information she had provided through elaborate academic deceptions. "Senator Mills, electronic surveillance has confirmed coordination among surviving Manning network members who are planning to continue their research through systematic elimination of federal personnel. Dr. Vasquez's linguistic analysis provided crucial guidance for identifying the communication patterns that led to this discovery." Elena realized that her supernatural abilities had become essential to preventing a conspiracy that threatened the foundations of American democracy, but maintaining her involvement required increasingly elaborate deceptions that were approaching the limits of academic plausibility. Representative Chen was reviewing Manning's academic publications when he made a discovery that exposed the full scope of institutional corruption. Senator Mills, Manning's research was cited in federal training manuals, police academy curricula, and even Supreme Court decisions involving serial killer cases. His fabricated insights shaped American criminal justice policy for decades. The revelation sent shockwaves through the congressional investigators as they realized that Manning's influence had reached into the judicial branch itself. Supreme Court justices had based legal opinions on research derived from systematic murder, while federal judges had made sentencing decisions influenced by psychological profiles created by an active serial killer. Elena heard the voice of Dorothy Williams, murdered in 1987, speaking with the distinctive accent of Eastern Virginia while describing Manning's plans for influencing judicial appointments. Elena, they'd had judges on their payroll, not directly corrupt, but influenced through academic recommendations and professional networks. Manning's research shaped legal precedents that made it harder to prosecute serial killers, protecting his network while advancing their academic careers. Senator Mills was coordinating with Department of Justice officials when she received notification that the Manning investigation had attracted international attention from allied intelligence agencies. Dr. Vasquez, foreign governments are reporting similar corruption patterns in their own criminal justice systems, suggesting that Manning's network operated internationally through academic conferences and professional exchanges. Elena felt the supernatural voices confirming the global scope of Manning's conspiracy. Murdered women from multiple countries were speaking in various languages, describing an international network of researchers who used systematic murder to advance academic careers while corrupting criminal justice systems worldwide. But the most disturbing revelation came when Agent Brooks briefed the committee about current threats to the investigation itself. Senator Mills, we have evidence that Manning's network has infiltrated this congressional investigation through personnel with security clearances and administrative access. They're monitoring our proceedings while planning countermeasures to protect surviving network members. Elena realized that Manning's collaborators were present in the hearing room itself, listening to her testimony while planning her elimination as a threat to their continued operations. Representative Davidson was reviewing security protocols when she made a connection that threatened Elena's carefully constructed academic facade. Dr. Vasquez, your linguistic analysis has provided intelligence that exceeds any conventional academic methodology. Either you have access to classified sources you haven't disclosed, or your research methods involve techniques that aren't included in your official academic credentials. Elena felt herself approaching the moment of complete exposure. Representative Davidson was essentially demanding that she either admit to security violations or reveal supernatural abilities that would destroy her credibility. The choice was between professional destruction through criminal accusations or professional destruction through psychiatric evaluation. The crisis reached its peak when Senator Mills received an urgent communication from Capitol Police about immediate threats to congressional investigators. Dr. Vasquez, we have credible intelligence that Manning's network is planning to eliminate key witnesses in this investigation within the next 24 hours. Your continued safety requires protection that may limit your ability to provide additional analysis. Elena realized that her supernatural abilities had made her essential to preventing mass murder while simultaneously making her a target for elimination by the very conspiracy she was helping to expose. The voices of 63 murdered women were urging her toward complete honesty, arguing that conventional law enforcement had proven inadequate to address threats that supernatural intelligence could prevent. Senator Mills, Elena said with quiet desperation, I need to tell you something about my research methods that may be difficult to accept through conventional understanding. The hearing room fell silent as Elena prepared to cross the line between academic deception and supernatural revelation. She realized that protecting American democracy might require sacrificing her professional credibility while trusting that institutional leaders could accept extraordinary abilities when faced with extraordinary threats. Representative Chen looked up from his classified briefings with sharp attention. Dr. Vasquez, are you suggesting that your research involves classified sources or techniques that weren't included in your background investigation? Elena felt the weight of 63 murdered women's voices urging her toward complete honesty, regardless of professional consequences. Representative Chen, my research involves communication techniques that conventional academic training doesn't address. The victims in the Manning case have been providing testimony that conventional investigation couldn't access.
The statement hung in the air like an unexploded bomb as congressional investigators processed implications that challenged everything they understood about criminal investigation and academic research. Elena had essentially admitted to supernatural abilities while facing the most powerful oversight committee in the American government. Senator Mills exchanged glances with her colleagues that conveyed the gravity of Elena's revelation. Dr. Vasquez, are you claiming that your investigative insights come from communication with murder victims? Elena realized she had crossed the point of no return. Senator Mills, I'm claiming that the victims in this case have been trying to communicate information that could save lives and expose corruption that conventional investigation has failed to address for decades. My role has been translating their testimony into intelligence that federal law enforcement could act upon. The hearing room erupted in shocked murmurs as congressional investigators grappled with testimony that challenged the foundations of empirical investigation while providing intelligence that had proven essential to preventing mass murder and exposing systematic corruption. Representative Davidson stood up from her seat with obvious professional confusion. Dr. Vasquez, you're testifying under oath before a congressional committee that you communicate with the dead? Elena felt the supernatural voices providing her with strength to complete her revelation regardless of consequences. Representative Davidson, I'm testifying that murder victims have been providing testimony about their deaths and about ongoing criminal activity that threatens federal personnel and American democratic institutions. Conventional investigation proved inadequate to address these threats, while supernatural communication has provided intelligence that saved lives and exposed corruption reaching into the highest levels of government. Elena had finally revealed the truth about her extraordinary abilities, knowing that her career was probably over, but that 63 murdered women would finally have their testimony heard by the people with authority to act on their warnings and provide the justice that conventional law enforcement had failed to deliver for over 4 decades. 6 months after Elena Vasquez testified before Congress about her ability to communicate with murder victims, she stood in the newly constructed Paranormal Criminal Investigation Division headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia, watching federal agents learn techniques that would have been considered science fiction just a year earlier. The woman who had been mocked for her Louisiana accent now directed the most revolutionary advancement in criminal investigation since the development of DNA analysis, leading a team of specialists who combined supernatural abilities with conventional law enforcement to solve cases that had baffled authorities for decades. The transformation of American criminal justice had been swift and comprehensive. Elena's congressional testimony, initially met with skepticism and institutional resistance, had been validated by results that conventional investigation couldn't match. Within 3 months of revealing her abilities, Elena had helped solve 47 cold cases across 12 states, while identifying corruption networks that reached into federal agencies, state governments, and international law enforcement organizations. Director Amanda Foster, Elena's former colleague who had been promoted to lead the new division, approached Elena's office carrying case files that represented the most challenging unsolved murders in American history. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit had been restructured to incorporate paranormal investigation techniques, while Elena's protocols for supernatural communication had been adopted by police departments in 36 states. Elena, we've got a request from the International Criminal Court about war crimes investigations in Eastern Europe, Foster said, spreading photographs across Elena's desk. Mass graves containing victims from ethnic conflicts in the 1990s.
Conventional investigation has reached dead ends, but surviving family members are requesting paranormal assistance to identify perpetrators and locate additional burial sites. Elena studied the case materials while feeling the familiar presence of supernatural voices beginning to speak in languages she didn't recognize. Her abilities had evolved significantly since the Manning case, expanding beyond English-speaking murder victims to include communications from spirits worldwide who had been waiting decades or centuries for someone capable of hearing their testimony. The voice of Maria Petrova, speaking in accented English overlaid with Bosnian dialects, began describing war crimes that conventional investigation had failed to document. Elena, they threw us into mines after killing our families. The commanders kept records of everything, buried in metal boxes near the primary grave sites. But there are 7 locations, not 3 like the investigators believe. Elena had developed sophisticated techniques for translating supernatural intelligence into actionable investigation without revealing her sources to international authorities who might not accept paranormal evidence. Her success with the Manning case had established protocols that allowed supernatural insights to be presented as advanced analytical techniques while maintaining credibility with conventional law enforcement. Director Foster, Elena said carefully, based on preliminary analysis of the case materials, I believe the investigation should focus on expanded geographical surveys around known burial sites. The perpetrators likely maintained documentation that would be preserved in locations connected to but separate from the primary grave sites. Foster nodded with professional trust that Elena had earned through 6 months of extraordinary results. The Paranormal Criminal Investigation Division had achieved a solve rate of 93% for cases involving supernatural communication, establishing Elena's credibility within federal law enforcement while attracting international attention from criminal justice agencies worldwide. Agent Michael Rodriguez, the division's new liaison with international law enforcement, entered Elena's office carrying communications from Interpol that represented requests for paranormal assistance from 14 countries. Elena's reputation had spread through global law enforcement networks as word of her abilities reached investigators struggling with cold cases that conventional methods couldn't solve. Elena, we've got formal requests from Scotland Yard about the Yorkshire Ripper copycat murders, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police about missing Indigenous women, and the Australian Federal Police about serial killings in the outback, Rodriguez said, arranging international case files on her desk. Every major law enforcement agency in the English-speaking world wants access to our supernatural investigation techniques. Elena felt the weight of international responsibility settling over her like a suffocating blanket. Her abilities had transformed from personal gift to institutional resource, making her essential to criminal investigations worldwide while creating expectations that sometimes exceeded what supernatural communication could provide. The voice of Sarah Mackenzie, murdered in Scotland in 2003, began speaking with a Highland accent while describing a killer who had evaded British authorities for 2 decades. Elena, he's still active, but he moved to Ireland after the British investigation got too close. The local police there don't know they're dealing with someone who's killed across 3 countries. Elena realized that her supernatural abilities were revealing criminal networks that operated internationally without detection through jurisdictional limitations that prevented adequate law enforcement coordination. Her communications with murder victims provided intelligence that transcended national boundaries, offering insights into criminal activities that conventional investigation couldn't access. Director Foster was revealing Elena's case statistics when she made an observation that illustrated the division's extraordinary impact on American criminal justice. Elena, in 6 months, you've identified corruption in 4 federal agencies, solved cases spanning 5 decades, and provided intelligence that prevented an estimated 37 murders. Your success rate exceeds every conventional investigation technique the Bureau has ever developed. Elena felt a moment of professional pride, tempered by awareness that her abilities came with moral responsibilities that extended far beyond career advancement. The voices of murdered victims had become a constant presence in her consciousness, providing testimony about crimes that spanned centuries while demanding justice that conventional systems had failed to deliver for over 4 decades. The transformation extended beyond Elena's personal success to institutional changes that were reshaping criminal investigation throughout American law enforcement. Police departments had begun recruiting personnel with reported supernatural abilities, while federal agencies developed training programs that incorporated paranormal investigation techniques alongside conventional forensic analysis.
Agent Jennifer Walsh, the forensic psychiatrist who had survived Manning's attack, approached Elena's office carrying research proposals that would formalize supernatural investigation as an academic discipline. Walsh's near-death experience had opened her consciousness to limited supernatural communication, making her an invaluable researcher for developing scientific frameworks around paranormal criminal investigation. Elena, I've been working with universities to establish degree programs in paranormal criminology, Walsh said, spreading academic proposals across Elena's desk. Yale, Harvard, and Georgetown want to develop curricula that combine traditional criminal justice education with training in supernatural communication techniques. Elena studied the proposals while listening to supernatural voices that were providing guidance about institutional development. The spirits seemed to understand that formalizing paranormal investigation would provide justice for countless murder victims whose cases had remained unsolved due to conventional law enforcement limitations. The voice of Catherine Morrison, Elena's first supernatural contact from the Manning case, spoke with satisfied authority about the transformation her testimony had enabled. Elena, we've been waiting centuries for someone who could hear our voices and translate them into justice. Your work has opened doors that will never close again. Elena realized that her revelation of supernatural abilities had created permanent changes in how American society approached criminal investigation and justice for murder victims. The institutional skepticism that had initially marginalized her had been replaced by recognition that conventional methods were inadequate for addressing the full scope of criminal activity that supernatural intelligence could reveal. The division's most significant breakthrough came when Elena's team identified a human trafficking network that had operated internationally for over 30 years while evading detection through sophisticated corruption and jurisdictional manipulation. Supernatural communication with murdered victims provided intelligence about current operations, financial structures, and political connections that conventional investigation would have taken years to uncover. Agent Rodriguez coordinated with international law enforcement to conduct simultaneous raids that dismantled trafficking operations across 6 countries while rescuing over 200 victims who had been held in conditions that amounted to modern slavery. The success of this operation established paranormal investigation as an essential tool for addressing transnational criminal organizations. Elena, Rodriguez said during their weekly international coordination meeting, the trafficking case results convinced Interpol to establish a permanent paranormal investigation unit. They want you to train investigators from 24 countries in supernatural communication techniques. Elena felt the magnitude of institutional transformation that her abilities had enabled. The woman who had been mocked for her accent was now reshaping global criminal justice while providing voice to murder victims whose testimony had been silenced by death for decades or centuries. But the most profound transformation was personal. Elena's relationship with supernatural communication had evolved from frightening anomaly to purposeful calling that provided meaning beyond any career achievement. The voices of murdered victims had become trusted colleagues whose testimony guided her daily work while offering perspectives on justice that transcended conventional legal frameworks. Elena stood at her office window overlooking the Potomac River, watching tour boats carry visitors past monuments that honored American democracy while reflecting on how supernatural revelation had strengthened institutional justice rather than undermining it. Her abilities had exposed corruption while providing tools for prevention that conventional oversight had failed to develop. The voice of Rebecca Patterson, murdered in 1983, spoke with gentle pride about the changes Elena's work had created. Elena, because of your courage to reveal the truth, hundreds of families finally have answers about their loved ones. The fear we lived with for decades has been replaced by hope that justice is possible even when conventional systems fail. Elena realized that her transformation from marginalized academic to essential investigator represented broader changes in how American society approached differences that challenged conventional understanding. The institutional prejudice that had initially dismissed her abilities had been replaced by recognition that diversity in human capabilities strengthened rather than weakened collective problem-solving capacity. Director Foster approached Elena's office carrying notification of the most significant recognition her work had received. "Elena, the president wants to meet with you about establishing a national paranormal investigation institute that would coordinate supernatural criminal investigation across all federal agencies. Your division would become the model for a permanent transformation of American law enforcement." Elena felt the weight of historical responsibility as she prepared to meet with the highest levels of American government about institutionalizing supernatural investigation. The woman who had been denied respect due to her accent was now positioned to reshape federal law enforcement while providing voice to murder victims whose testimony would guide American justice for generations to come. The voices of 63 murdered women from the Manning case spoke in unison, their combined testimony creating a supernatural chorus that celebrated justice finally achieved through Elena's willingness to risk everything for truth. As Elena prepared for her meeting with the president, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from the basement archives of the Richmond FBI field office to the highest levels of American government. The supernatural abilities that had initially seemed like professional liability had become the foundation for revolutionary advances in criminal investigation while providing justice for victims whose cases had been abandoned by conventional law enforcement. But Elena knew that her work was just beginning. Thousands of murder victims worldwide were waiting for someone who could hear their testimony and translate it into justice that death had seemed to make impossible. The woman who had been laughed at for her accent had discovered that the most important communication often comes from voices that conventional society couldn't hear. Voices that spoke the universal language of truth, demanding recognition regardless of the prejudices that tried to silence them. Elena's transformation was complete, but her mission would continue for as long as murdered victims needing someone who could hear their stories and ensure that death would no longer provide immunity for those who believed they could kill without consequence. The language of the dead had finally found its translator, and justice would never be the same. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.